Your hand is changing. We are already dead. Look at your jaw.
The sky didn't just turn dark. It turned bruised. A deep, sickly purple that looked like an internal hemorrhage in the atmosphere. I've lived in the high desert for 12 years, and I've seen monsoons that could strip the paint off a truck. But I've never seen the air turn heavy like this. It felt like walking through invisible grease. My name is Julian, and I was just trying to get home before the passes closed. I pulled my vintage Chevy into the last stop, a rusted-out husk of a station sitting on a stretch of Highway 50 that God forgot to map. The neon sign hummed with a dying electrical buzz, flickering, gas, eat, survive. I remember thinking that last part was a joke, a bit of kitschy desert humor. Inside, the air smelled of stale coffee and industrial-strength floor cleaner. There were 4 others already there, trapped by the sudden wall of wind that had turned the road into a river of sand and debris. First, there was Silas, a man who looked like he'd been carved out of dry wood. He was the attendant, moving with a limp that suggested a long life of hard labor. Then there was a couple, Marcus and Sarah. Marcus was the kind of guy who wore an expensive watch to a desert hike, his nerves frayed thin, pacing the aisles like a caged animal. Sarah sat in one of the booths, her hands shaking as she clutched a lukewarm mug of tea. Finally, there was a woman in the back, leaning against the freezer, Wren. She was quiet, wearing a tactical jacket, her eyes constantly scanning the exits. "The radio says the bridge at Miller's Creek is out," Silas grunted, tossing a grease-stained rag onto the counter. "Nobody's going anywhere for at least 6 hours. Maybe 10. 10 hours. Marcus snapped. "I have a board meeting in Reno. There has to be a back road." "Sure," Silas said, his eyes turning to the window where the rain was now hitting the glass with the force of gravel. "If you want to end up at the bottom of a ravine, that wind out there is hitting 80 miles per hour. It'll flip that SUV of yours like a coin." I took a seat at the counter, trying to ignore the way the building groaned. It wasn't just the wind. It was a vibration, a low-frequency hum that made the teeth in my jaw ache. "Do you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The wind?" Marcus asked impatiently. "No," she said, looking toward the ceiling. "The scratching." We all went silent. Above the roar of the storm, there was a rhythmic, metallic sound. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Like something with very long nails was testing the structural integrity of the corrugated tin roof. Wren moved first. She walked to the window, pulling back the heavy thermal curtain. "The lights are out across the valley," she noted. "But look at the perimeter fence." I stood up and joined her. The gas station was surrounded by a 10-foot chain-link fence. In the strobing flashes of lightning, I saw it. The fence hadn't been blown over. It had been peeled back. The heavy steel wire was curled like a sardine can lid. "A gust of wind didn't do that," I said, my heart starting to thud against my ribs. "Look at the pumps," Wren pointed. One of the gas pumps had been ripped from its moorings. Not by the storm, but by sheer force. The heavy rubber hose was severed, but it wasn't a clean cut. It looked chewed. "Silas," I called out, "does anyone else live out here? Any wild animals? Maybe a mountain lion?" Silas walked over, his face turning a shade of pale that made his weathered skin look like parchment. "There ain't no cat in Nevada big enough to peel steel, son." Suddenly, the power killed. The hum of the refrigerators died. The buzzing neon went silent. Total, suffocating darkness swallowed the room. "Nobody move," Wren's voice was sharp. I heard the click of a heavy-duty flashlight. A beam of white light cut through the gloom, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Then came the scream. It wasn't from us. It was from outside. A long, agonizing wail that sounded human, but then shifted, pitching up into a frequency that shattered the glass of the condiment jars on the counter. Something hit the front door. Hard. The heavy safety glass spiderwebbed, but held. "Get away from the windows," I yelled, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her toward the center of the store. We huddled behind the heavy oak counter as Silas reached under the register and pulled out a double-barreled shotgun. His hands weren't shaking anymore. They were locked in a grip of pure survival. Whatever that is, Silas whispered. It ain't looking for shelter. The scratching on the roof started again. Faster now. More aggressive. And then we heard it. A voice. It came from right outside the door, muffled by the wind but unmistakably clear. Help? Please. Marcus? Is that you? It's so cold. Marcus froze. His face went white. That sounds like my sister. But my sister is in London. Don't answer it, Rin commanded, her flashlight fixed on the door. Marcus, please. The voice cried again. Open the door. My fingers. They're falling off. It's so cold. It sounded exactly like a woman in distress. But as the voice continued, it began to loop. The same inflection. The same pause for breath. Like a recording played on a broken machine. It's mimicking, I whispered, the horror of it sinking in. It's not your sister, Marcus. It's hearing your name and using it. The glass door groaned. A pale, elongated hand pressed against the spider-webbed pane. It had too many knuckles. The skin was the color of a drowned corpse, and the fingernails were shards of black obsidian. Welcome to the long night, Silas said, his thumb clicking the safety off. The thing at the door didn't break in. Not yet. It just lingered, pressing its distorted face against the glass. In the flicker of Ren's flashlight, I caught a glimpse of it. It had no eyes, just smooth, translucent skin stretched over a skull that looked far too large for its neck. Where a mouth should be, there was a vertical slit that vibrated every time it spoke. Marcus, open the door. It droned. The voice was losing its human quality, becoming a metallic rasp. Shut up. Just shut up. Marcus screamed, grabbing a metal thermos from the shelf and hurling it at the door. The creature didn't flinch. It began to tap. Tap, tap, tap. A code. It's testing the glass, Rin said, her voice eerily calm. It's looking for the stress point. Julian, help me block the door with those heavy soda crates. Silas, keep that gun leveled. If the glass goes, you fire. We worked in a feverish blur. Every shadow in the corners of the store felt like it was reaching out for us. The psychological weight of the storm outside and the predator outside the door was starting to crack us. I can't stay here, Sarah whimpered. She was hyperventilating. We're going to die in a gas station. We're going to be snacks for some thing. Listen to me, Sarah, I said, grabbing her shoulders. We have the walls. We have the gun. As long as we stay together, we're okay. But together was a relative term. Around 2 a.m., the temperature inside the station plummeted. Our breath came out in white plumes. The low-frequency hum returned, louder now, vibrating in our marrow. The back office, Silas whispered. There's a crawl space in the ceiling that leads to the attic. We can't stay in the main room. If they get through the roof, we're cornered. They? I asked. You think there's more than one? As if in answer, a chorus of voices erupted from every side of the building. Help me. Is someone there? I'm lost in the rain. Marcus? Sarah? Julian? Dozens of them. A sea of stolen voices surrounding the station. They weren't just predators. They were collectors. We retreated into the cramped back office. Silas climbed up a ladder first, disappearing into the dark attic space. He helped Sarah up, then Marcus. I went next, feeling the cold air from the office floor nipping at my heels. Ren was the last one up, pulling the ladder after her and sliding the heavy wooden hatch shut. The attic was narrow, filled with old registers and boxes of moth-eaten uniforms. We sat in a line, the only light coming from Ren's fading flashlight. We need to talk about what those things are, Marcus said, his voice jagged. Those aren't animals. Those are demons. They're biological, Ren countered. I've seen things like this in the deep sea, bioluminescent mimics, but they've adapted for land. They feed on the electrical impulses of the brain. That's why they want your voice. They're taking your patterns. How do you know that? I asked, looking at her. She hadn't mentioned her background. Ren didn't answer. She was looking at the floorboards. Suddenly, Silas started to cough. A deep, wet sound. "You okay, old man?" I asked. Silas didn't respond. He just kept coughing. And then he started to speak. But it wasn't his voice. "The bridge at Miller's Creek is out," Silas said. But it sounded like my voice. Exact same pitch. Exact same cadence. We all scrambled away from him. Silas was sitting in the corner, his head lolling to the side. His eyes, usually a clouded blue, were now turning a milky, translucent white. "Silas!" Sarah screamed. "Nobody's going anywhere for at least 6 hours," Silas said, still using my voice. His skin began to ripple. I watched in horror as his jawbone seemed to detach and elongate. His fingers grew, the nails darkening into black shards. He wasn't Silas anymore. He was becoming one of them. "He was bitten," Rin hissed, raising her light. I looked at Silas's leg. There was a small, jagged tear in his trousers. He must have been nipped when he was checking the perimeter earlier. The infection, or whatever it was rewriting his DNA in real time. "Get away from him," I yelled. But Silas, the thing that used to be Silas, didn't attack. It just sat there, mimicking us. "I have a board meeting in Reno," it said in Marcus's voice. "I'm just trying to get home," it said in mine. Then, it tilted its head and looked at Marcus. "Marcus, give me your hand." Marcus, driven by a cocktail of terror and some strange, hypnotic pull from the hum, actually started to reach out. "Marcus, no." I tackled him, pinning him to the attic floor. The Silas creature stood up. It was nearly 7 feet tall now, its body hunched to fit under the rafters. It didn't use the hatch. It simply leaned its weight against the exterior wall of the attic. The wood screamed and gave way. The creature tumbled out into the storm, disappearing into the purple rain. We were left staring at the gaping hole in the wall. The wind howled through the opening, bringing the scent of ozone and rotting meat. "It took his memories," Sarah sobbed. "It took everything he was." "It's not just taking," Rin said, her voice trembling for the first time. "It's learning. And now it knows exactly how many of us are left. It knows we have a gun. And it knows we're terrified. We were no longer just survivors. We were a library of identities, and the things outside were hungry for a new volume." The storm reached its crescendo at 4 a.m. The building was shaking so violently I thought the foundation would crack. We had retreated back down to the main floor, figuring the open space gave us a better chance to move than the cramped attic. We had the shotgun, but only 4 shells left. Marcus had completely broken down, sitting in the middle of the floor and humming to himself to drown out the voices outside. Sarah was catatonic, staring at the spiderweb door. Run and I stood guard. "Julian," Rin said softly, "if we don't make it, there's something you should know." "Save the confessions for the morning," I said, my eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the glass. "No," she said. "I wasn't trapped here. I followed them. I'm a researcher with the Department of Atmospheric Anomalies. We've been tracking these echoes for months. They appear during these specific low-pressure cells." I looked at her, anger bubbling up. "You knew? You knew what these things were and you let us sit here like bait." "I didn't know they could infect this fast," she whispered. "The Silas transformation. That's a new mutation. They're evolving. They don't just want to eat us anymore. They want to replace us." The tapping on the door stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the screaming. The wind seemed to hold its breath. Then the front door didn't break. It opened. The lock had been turned from the outside. Silas stood there, but he looked human again. He was wearing his greasy jumpsuit, his limp was back, and he held a flashlight. "It's okay, folks," Silas said. His voice was his own again. Warm, grumpy, real. "The storm's breaking. Highway patrol just pulled up. They've got a bus for us." Sarah stood up, a sob of relief breaking from her throat. "Silas? You're okay. Just a bit of a tumble," he smiled. "Come on, before the wind picks up again." Marcus stood up too, his eyes clearing. "Thank God. Let's go." They started toward the door. "Wait," I said, my gut churning. "Look at his shadow." The flashlight in Silas's hand was bright, casting a long shadow against the tile floor. But the shadow didn't have a limp. The shadow wasn't a man. The shadow was a towering, multi-limbed monstrosity with a vertical slit for a mouth. "It's a lure!" I screamed. Ren fired the shotgun. The blast hit Silas square in the chest. But there was no blood, just a spray of thick, black ichor that smelled like burnt rubber. The Silas skin sloughed off like a wet coat, revealing the pale, translucent horror beneath. It shrieked, a sound that felt like a hot wire being pulled through my brain. Everything happened in a flash of violence. The creature lunged. Ren pushed Marcus and Sarah toward the back storage room. I swung a heavy metal chair, catching the thing in its midsection. Felt like hitting a bag of wet concrete. "Run!" Ren yelled. We sprinted for the back. But as I passed the counter, I saw them. Not one. Not two. Dozens of them were crawling over the roof, peering through the broken glass, flowing into the station like a tide of pale flesh. We slammed the heavy steel door of the walk-in freezer and threw the bolt. It was silent and freezing. The hum of the cooling units was the only sound. "We're trapped," Marcus gasped. "There's no other way out." "We wait," Ren said, her breath hitching. "The sun will be up in an hour. They can't handle UV light. Their skin is too thin. If we can survive 1 hour in here, we're safe." We huddled together for warmth. The minutes felt like years. We heard them outside the freezer door. They weren't scratching anymore. They were talking. They were talking to each other. In our voices. "Is Julian in there?" A voice that sounded exactly like Ren asked. "Yes, he's with Sarah and Marcus." A voice that sounded like me replied. "We should wait. They'll come out eventually. They always get cold." It was a surreal, horrific experience, hearing a version of ourselves plan our demise. Finally, the temperature began to rise. A sliver of golden light cracked through the small, thick window at the top of the freezer door. "Morning," Sarah whispered. We waited another 30 minutes to be sure. When we finally pushed the door open, the gas station was a wreck. The shelves were overturned, the glass was gone, and the floor was covered in that black, drying ichor. But the creatures were gone. We stepped out into the crisp, morning air. The sky was a clear, mocking blue. A highway patrol car was sitting by the pumps, its lights flashing. An officer stood there, his back to us. "Hey!" Marcus shouted, waving his arms. "Over here. We need help." The officer turned around. It was a young man, maybe 25. He looked relieved. "Thank God. We saw the wreckage from the road. Are you guys okay?" "We're fine," I said, leaning against the doorframe, exhausted. "Just get us out of here." The officer nodded and walked toward us. He stopped a few feet away, looking at Marcus. "Marcus?" the officer asked. "Yeah," Marcus said. "Your sister in London," the officer said, his voice suddenly shifting, losing its tone. "She says, it's so cold." My heart stopped. I looked down at the officer's feet. He didn't have a shadow. I looked at Ren. She was smiling, not a human smile. Her jaw was beginning to slide too far to the left. "Julian," Ren said, but her voice was a perfect, crystalline echo of my own mother's voice. "Don't be afraid. The transition only hurts for a second." I realized then, with a crushing horror, that the Ren in the freezer with us wasn't the Ren who had entered the attic. Somewhere in the dark, in the chaos, she had been replaced. And I had been sitting in the dark with it for 3 hours, giving it every memory, every secret, every inflection of my soul. I looked at my own hands. The skin was beginning to turn a pale, translucent white. I tried to scream, but the only thing that came out was the sound of the wind. The siege wasn't over. It was just expanding.